No one noticed the custodian standing in the corner of the hallway. That was the point. Ethan Cole had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, the right angle to hold a mop, the right pace to move through corridors, so that men in tailored suits never had to register his existence. It was not a skill he was proud of. It was simply the skill the job required. Outside, snow was falling over downtown Chicago in thin, indifferent curtains, the kind that didn't accumulate much but changed the quality of the light, softened the hard edges of the skyline, made the city look briefly like something other than what it was. Inside the Nexagen Technologies building, the 43rd floor hummed with the particular tension of people who had too much to lose, and knew it. The building had 32 floors of open office space, 2 floors of executive suites, 1 floor of conference facilities with glass panel walls and catering service, and a maintenance team of 12 people, whose names none of the executives knew, and whose existence was registered about as frequently as the existence of the ventilation system. Ethan wrung the mop head over the bucket and watched the gray water swirl. He had a daughter to pick up at 3:15. He had a dentist appointment to reschedule. He had $11 in his checking account until Friday. These were the coordinates of his life, and they were enough. They had to be. The morning started the way most mornings did: a spilled coffee on the 7th floor, a clogged drain near the executive washrooms on the 9th, and a younger colleague named Derek Marsh, informing Ethan that the hallway near Conference Suite A needed to be finished before 9, not 9:30, because apparently the important people walking through it could not tolerate the smell of pine cleaner for longer than 40 minutes. "You understand me?" Derek asked. He was 26 and wore his badge on a lanyard with a carabiner clip, as though he might need to rappel somewhere at any moment. He had the particular energy of someone who had recently been given a small amount of supervisory authority and was still learning how to carry it without looking at it too obviously. "I understand," Ethan said, "and lose the earbuds. You look like you're not paying attention." Ethan removed the right earbud. The left one stayed in, hidden under the collar of his gray work shirt. Through it, a radio program ran its morning international segment. A French economist discussing post-election monetary policy. A correspondent in Riyadh reporting on a proposed infrastructure accord, and a brief segment out of Berlin where a municipal court was wrestling with a housing zoning dispute that had apparently been ongoing for 11 years. Ethan listened the way other men read the paper. He had been doing it long enough that he no longer thought of it as maintenance of his language skills, of the particular part of his brain that had once been his primary professional instrument. He thought of it the way a retired musician might think of running scales in the morning. Not preparation for anything. Simply the thing itself. The hallway near Conference Suite A was a 40-foot stretch of polished concrete and glass panel walls. The winter light came through the building's exterior windows at a low angle and made the floor look slightly warmer than it was. Ethan worked from the far end back toward the service corridor, moving the mop in the overlapping figure eights that his predecessor, a man named Gerald, who had retired at 72 after 30 years on the floor, had told him were more efficient than straight passes. Gerald had been right. Gerald had also told him, on his first week, that people on the executive floors did not really see maintenance staff, and that this was not something to take personally. "They're not seeing the building either," Gerald had said. "They're seeing the inside of their own heads. You're just part of the room to them." Ethan had found this neither insulting nor comforting, but accurate. He finished the hallway in 22 minutes. Then he moved his cart to the adjacent service corridor and stood near the utility closet, waiting for the next assignment. That was when he heard them, the voices coming from inside Suite A, whose walls were floor-to-ceiling glass panels framed in steel, soundproof technically. But the door to the adjoining server alcove had been left open by the overnight tech crew, and sound traveled through the gap in ways that the architects had apparently not accounted for. Ethan could hear everything. He did not intend to listen. He picked up his phone and opened the video call he'd been waiting for all morning. His daughter's face appeared on the screen, slightly blurred because the school's Wi-Fi was unreliable. Lily was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubborn jaw, and she was wearing the green sweater with the hood that she'd picked out herself at the thrift store. "Ba." She said the word she still used from when she was small, borrowed from the Vietnamese family next door, who had been their first neighbors after the move. She'd attached to it and never let go. "Hey, Bug," Ethan said quietly. "Everything good?" "Mrs. Alcott said my essay about the moon was excellent." "I know. I proofread it. You said it was fine." "Fine was me being restrained. It was very good." Lily smiled. "Are you going to be home on time today?" 3:15. "You always say that." "I'm always there," he said. She considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds brought to facts. Then she nodded, satisfied, and the call ended. Ethan put the phone in his breast pocket. He picked up the mop. He was 3 feet from the service corridor exit when he heard the first crack in the meeting, a voice, sharp and foreign, rising above the others. He stopped. His left earbud, still in, had been carrying a German language podcast. He pulled it out now. He stood very still. Victoria Hale had not slept well. This was not unusual. She rarely slept more than 5 hours. And she'd built her career on the premise that the hours between midnight and 6 were simply strategy time with fewer interruptions. But this morning, there was a specific dread coiled in her chest that caffeine had not touched. The Meridian Group was in Suite A. 3 partners representing a consortium of European and Middle Eastern capital 11 figures of combined assets, as her CFO had reminded her twice before breakfast. The deal on the table was $52 million in expansion capital, contingent on today's negotiation clearing 3 key structural requirements. They had been working toward this meeting for 8 months. There had been a preliminary term sheet in September, a revised one in November, and a third revision that had come back from Meridian's legal team with 27 annotated questions, which Ethan had not seen because at the time he had been on the 9th floor unblocking a drain. They had flown in from Frankfurt, from Zurich, from Doha, and Daniel Reyes, Nexigen's head of international relations and the only person on the payroll fluent in both German and Arabic, had not appeared. His phone went to voicemail. His emergency contact, a sister in Tucson, said he'd sent a brief message the previous night. A family matter? Possibly a flight. No further detail. Victoria's assistant had spent 90 minutes trying to locate a credentialed replacement. There was no one. The 2 consultants on the emergency list both had prior commitments. A university contact could be available in 4 hours. The meeting was scheduled for 9. Victoria walked into Suite A at 8:58, with a smile that cost her more than she would ever admit. She had been in business for 19 years. She had negotiated in circumstances far worse than this, a quarterly board meeting, where 2 of the directors were openly hostile, a media crisis that required her to speak for 45 minutes without a prepared statement. She had handled all of it, but language was different. You could improvise around missing information. You could not improvise around a missing language. The words were either there or they weren't. The Meridian Group's lead partner was a man named Heinrich Brauer, tall, in his 60s, with a silver clip on his tie, and the measured patience of someone who had ended many negotiations simply by waiting. Beside him sat Farouk Al-Mansouri, the consortium's legal principal, and a younger analyst whose name Victoria had not yet caught. They spoke to each other in low, quick German, punctuated occasionally by phrases that tilted into Arabic. Victoria's German was tourist grade. Her Arabic was non-existent. She opened with pleasantries in English. Brauer responded in English. Careful, accented, correct. Al-Mansouri nodded, but said nothing. 40 minutes into the meeting, when the conversation turned to the specific language of the equity clause, Brauer said something to Al-Mansouri in German, and Al-Mansouri replied, and their exchange lasted 2 full minutes, and Victoria understood not one word of it. She held her expression. She waited. She looked at the junior member of her own legal team, who gave the microscopic shrug of someone who had absolutely nothing to offer. Then Brauer turned back to her and said, in English, "I think we need to clarify the threshold conditions before we proceed." His tone was pleasant. His meaning was not. Victoria had been in business for 19 years. She knew what clarify the threshold conditions meant when it was said in that tone. It meant, "We are looking for a reason to leave." Her deputy, Marcus Cheng, leaned toward her. "We could request a recess," he whispered. "Absolutely not," she said, still smiling. Brauer was consulting a document now, running his finger along a margin note. And Al-Mansouri said something that made the younger analyst frown. Victoria watched their faces and understood nothing, and felt the deal, the one she had spent 8 months constructing, beginning to dissolve like paper in water. She was very good at not showing this. She had practiced not showing things since she was 23, and had sat across from a man who was twice her age and 4 times her net worth, and had spoken to her as though she might be someone's secretary who had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. She had not shown him anything either. She had simply continued. Then she heard it. A voice from just outside the open service alcove door. Not loud, precise, German, flawless. Ethan had not planned to speak. He had stood in the service corridor for 6 minutes, listening. He understood the meeting's dynamics in the way that someone who had once spent years inside rooms exactly like this one still could: the hierarchies, the pauses, the weight of unsaid things. He heard what Brower said in German. He heard Al-Mansouri's response. He heard the specific phrase Al-Mansouri used, a legal idiom from contract law that, translated directly, would imply that Nexigen had misrepresented its subsidiary structure. They weren't accusing, they were probing. But nobody in that room seemed to understand the difference. And in a negotiation of this size, the difference was everything. Ethan stood with one hand on the wall of the service corridor and thought about it. The rational argument for not acting was straightforward. This was not his meeting, not his company, not his problem. He was here to clean floors and go home at 3:15. The rational argument for acting was also straightforward. He could see what was happening. He had the means to stop it. And no one else in that room did. He had spent 3 years assembling a life around the first argument. He thought about Lily. He thought about the words she'd said to him 2 weeks ago, after he'd let a neighbor take credit for fixing a broken fence that Ethan had actually repaired, because he hadn't wanted the awkwardness of correcting anyone. Lily had watched this happen from the porch with her chin in her hands. "You're always helping," she'd said. "How come you never let anyone know it's you?" He hadn't answered her well. He'd said something about it not mattering. She'd looked at him the way 8-year-olds looked at adults who said obviously wrong things. And then gone inside. The screen door had not slammed. She was too careful for that, but the quiet it made when it closed had stayed with him. He pushed open the service alcove door. The guard, a large man named Clive who worked the executive floor and had never in 3 years said anything to Ethan except "move your cart," stepped forward immediately. "Sir, this area." Ethan spoke in German. Calm, unhurried German, addressed at the window of the glass-walled conference room rather than at Clive. The clause in question refers to a subsidiary disclosure requirement under the 2019 Frankfurt Accord, he said. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding about which entity carries the obligation." Every head in Suite A turned. Clive stopped moving. Brower's hand, which had been resting on the table, went still. Victoria said, later, that the strangest part was not the German. It was the calm. There was no performance in it, no hesitation, no moment where the speaker seemed to be searching for a word or adjusting for the formality of the room. The man with the mop handle still loose in his left hand spoke the way someone spoke when they were very certain of what they knew and very unconcerned about whether you believed them. It was the tone of a person who had no stake in being impressive, which was, paradoxically, the most impressive thing about it. "Let him in," she said. Clive looked at her. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to register the question but short enough not to constitute a challenge, and then he stepped aside. Ethan walked into Suite A. He set nothing down. He did not introduce himself. He did not apologize for the interruption. He looked at Brower and addressed him directly in German, then turned to Al-Mansouri and repeated the substance of it in Arabic, a different dialect, precisely calibrated to Al-Mansouri's region, the kind of regional specificity that required not just fluency, but attention. The younger analyst's mouth opened slightly. What followed was not a scene from a film. There were no gasps, no dramatic revelations, no visible pivot in the room's emotional weather. It was subtler than that. Brower, who had been leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man preparing to leave, leaned forward by perhaps 3 inches. Al-Mansouri, who had been speaking to his colleague in a way that excluded the room, began to speak to Ethan directly. Victoria watched this and understood, with the part of her brain that processed everything as resource and risk, that she was witnessing something rare, a person who spoke not just the words but the register, the implication, the careful architecture of what remained unsaid. Marcus Cheng slid a legal pad across the table, scrawled 2 words. "Who is he?" Victoria didn't answer. She was listening. Ethan was explaining, in German, that the subsidiary in question, a logistics arm Nexigen, had acquired 14 months prior, did carry a disclosure obligation, but that this obligation had been fulfilled through a filing that Al-Mansouri's legal team may not have had access to, because it had been submitted under a predecessor entity name. He said this without accusation. He said it as a clarification. He said it the way a man said something obvious that everyone had simply overlooked. Brower looked at Al-Mansouri. Al-Mansouri looked at the document in front of him. Then Brower laughed a short, genuine sound. "You should have led with this," he said. "In English now. We weren't aware of the confusion," Victoria said smoothly, "until just now." Brower nodded. He gestured at Ethan. "He can stay?" "Yes," Victoria said. "He can stay." The meeting shifted. Victoria found her footing again. She was good at this, at reading a room and adjusting her weight accordingly, but she did not pretend that the ground had not moved under her. She kept Ethan close, positioned to her right, and she watched the way the Meridian group responded to his presence. They trusted him. That was the plainest way to say it, not in the naive sense of being charmed, but in the specific, professional sense of someone who had identified competence and adjusted their behavior accordingly. At 11:15, Al-Mansouri raised a concern about the revenue share model, and his phrasing was careful, deliberately ambiguous, in a way that could have been interpreted as either a deal-breaker or an opening. Ethan translated it both ways. He flagged the ambiguity quietly to Victoria, in English, in 2 sentences, and then held the silence while she processed it. "He's not objecting," Ethan said. "He's asking whether there's room." Victoria looked at him. "Is there? That depends on what you're willing to move." She thought for 4 seconds. Then she named a figure, a small adjustment to the equity distribution that her CFO had flagged as a possible lever. Al-Mansouri, when Ethan conveyed it, nodded once. The energy in the room changed by a few degrees, at some point during the 2nd hour. While Brower reviewed a revised clause document, Ethan switched briefly into a 3rd language, a particular phrase from the analyst's own dialect, something regional and small, that made the young man look up from his phone for the first time all morning. They exchanged a few words. The analyst smiled. Whatever had been said, it had nothing to do with equity structures. Marcus Cheng stopped trying to take notes and just watched. Later, after the session broke for a working lunch, Marcus caught Ethan in the hallway, near the elevator bank. "Where did you study?" he asked. Ethan picked up his mop cart, which he'd left by the supply closet. "I didn't." "Then how?" "I lived," Ethan said, and pushed the cart around the corner. He made a phone call in the service stairwell. His daughter's school answering machine picked up. He left a message for the front office. He might be slightly delayed at pickup. Could she wait in the aftercare room? There was a woman there named Sandra who knew Lily and would give her a snack. He stood in the stairwell for a moment after hanging up, his hand flat on the cold concrete wall. The stairwell smelled of dust and the faint metallic trace of the ventilation system. It was very quiet here. The way working parts of buildings were always quieter than the parts people occupied. He had spent 3 years finding these spaces. The freight elevator landings, the supply corridors, the stairwells, and he understood now that he had found them not only out of professional necessity, but because they were places where he could think without the ambient pressure of being looked at or not looked at. Then he went back upstairs. There was a flashback he never spoke aloud. A conference room in Geneva, a decade and some years ago. 3 governments and a disputed water treaty and 4 languages rotating around a table for 9 hours. He had been the one standing at the center of it, not holding a mop, not invisible. He had worn a suit that cost more than a month of what he earned now, and he had stood at the head of the room and moved between German and French and Arabic, with the ease of someone who understood that language was not merely communication, but architecture that the way something was said determined, more than half the time, whether it could be agreed to. He had been the youngest person in the room by 11 years, and the one they all looked at when the thing seemed about to break apart. He had held it together. He had been very good at holding things together. He had believed then that this was a permanent condition of his life, that he would spend it in rooms where things needed holding, and that he would hold them, and that the accumulated weight of those moments would mean something in a way he could not entirely articulate but felt with certainty. And then, 2 years later, everything that mattered had broken anyway, not a treaty, not a deal, but the particular small world that had been his life, the one that included a woman named Claire and a baby girl just learning to walk, and a future that had seemed, for a few years, genuinely possible. Cancer moved fast in Claire. They'd had 9 months from diagnosis to the last afternoon in the hospital room, and by the end, Ethan had not slept in 3 days, and had not cried yet because he was still, somehow, holding things together. He had resigned his position 2 weeks after the funeral. He had not explained why to anyone who asked. He was not sure he could have. There was no clean explanation. There was only the understanding that the version of himself who had stood in that Geneva conference room and moved between languages like water, moving between vessels, was not a version he could sustain in the same form, in the same life, with a 2-year-old daughter, and no one else. He had needed to become smaller, more present, more located. Chicago had been Sandra's suggestion, a former colleague of Claire's who had said, with the practical kindness of someone who understood grief as a logistical problem as much as an emotional one, that the schools in the North Side neighborhoods were good, and the cost of living was manageable, and the city was large enough that he would not feel watched. That had been 3 years ago. He was still not sure if he was glad he'd come. He was sure, most days, that it had been the right decision. The afternoon session was different in texture, less exploratory, more tactical. Brower had reviewed the subsidiary documentation over lunch and returned satisfied with its substance. Al-Mansouri had questions about a revenue protection clause. The conversation was moving toward a close. Then the young analyst, whose name turned out to be Tobias, and who had spent the morning largely silent, asked a question in German that did not seem, on its surface, like a trap. He asked about Nexogen's exposure in the event of a regulatory reclassification of one of its core data products. It was a reasonable question. He phrased it in a way that was also reasonable, but embedded in the phrasing was a conditional construction, a grammatical structure specific to certain German legal documents that implied the questioner already had reason to believe such a reclassification was imminent. Ethan translated it straight. Then he added, quietly, in English, for Victoria's ear only, he's using the construction for an anticipated event. Someone gave him a tip. Victoria's expression did not change. How confident are you? The phrasing is deliberate. He could have used a hypothetical. He didn't. A 3-second pause. Then Victoria said, to the room. That's a thoughtful question. I'd like to respond to it carefully, if you'll allow us a moment. She turned to Marcus and said, very quietly, get Davies on the phone, right now. I need to know if there's been any regulatory movement in the last 72 hours. Marcus left. The room held its breath, in the polite way of people pretending to review documents. 4 minutes later, Marcus returned with a notepad. He passed it to Victoria. She read it. Her face did not move. There had been a preliminary inquiry, not a reclassification, but an internal review by a regulatory body, triggered by a competitor's complaint. It had been filed 2 days ago. It was not public, but someone had leaked it. Ethan watched Victoria process this. He had seen people receive bad news in negotiation rooms before. The ones who lasted were the ones who could transform the news into a new variable rather than a defeat. Victoria looked up. She spoke in English. Clearly, for everyone in the room, there is an ongoing internal review of industry data classification standards, she said. We are aware of it. We believe it will result in a clarification that is favorable to platforms with the kind of robust compliance architecture Nexogen has built over the last 4 years. We would welcome the opportunity to walk you through that architecture. Brower looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at his hands. Ethan translated it into German. He added nothing. He took nothing away. Al-Mansouri said something in Arabic short to Brower. He says, Ethan told Victoria that he's impressed you didn't pretend not to know. Victoria held the pause for one beat. Tell him, she said, that I've never found pretending to be an efficient use of time. Ethan translated it. Al-Mansouri smiled for the first time all day. By 4 o'clock, the session had produced a term sheet, not signed, that would take another 2 weeks of document review, but agreed in principle, which in practice meant that Brower had shaken Victoria's hand and said, in German, that he believed they had found the right partners. Ethan translated it. He did not add anything about what he believed. After the Meridian group had been escorted to their car service, Victoria's team gathered in the debrief room. Ethan was not invited. He collected his cart from the service corridor and took the freight elevator down to the supply level to restock cleaning solution. He was on the phone with the aftercare room at Lily's school. Sandra, confirming that Lily was fine, was eating a granola bar. He was asking when her dad was coming when Marcus Cheng appeared at the base of the freight elevator. Miss Hale would like to see you. Ethan looked at his watch. It was 4:17. I have to pick up my daughter at 5. I'll tell her. But she does want to speak with you before you go. He made arrangements. Sandra would stay until 5:30. Lily would not be happy, but she was resilient in the specific, patient way of children who have learned that their father does not leave them unless something requires it. Victoria Hale's office was on the 45th floor. It was a large room, mostly glass, with a view of the city and the lake beyond it, the lake running gray and flat under the low winter sky. There were 2 chairs in front of the desk and a couch along the left wall that had, by the look of it, been sat on very rarely. The desk itself was clear, except for a legal pad and a pen and a single framed photograph that Ethan could not see from where he stood. She was at the window when he arrived, still in the suit she'd worn to the meeting, her arms crossed loosely over her chest in the posture of someone thinking rather than waiting. Sit, she said. I'm fine standing. She turned. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since 11 that morning, with the careful, measuring attention of someone who has misjudged a situation and is recalibrating. He had seen this look before. He had seen it in conference rooms and committee chambers, and across the table from people who made decisions that affected other people's lives, and he had learned, over years, not to find it unsettling. It was simply what happened when a person encountered information that didn't fit their existing model. Who are you? She said. Ethan Cole. I'm on the maintenance staff. 3rd floor to 14. And the executive corridor on rotation. That's not what I asked. He was quiet. She sat down, which he hadn't expected. She put her hands flat on the desk. I had you researched this afternoon. While the meeting was still going, she paused. You worked for the Intergovernmental Language and Mediation Office for 11 years. Before that, 2 years with a private diplomatic consultancy. You were involved in 7 multilateral negotiations between 2008 and 2019. You speak, she glanced at a sheet on her desk, German, Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Mandarin, fluently, and apparently some regional variants that my research assistant gave up trying to list. Ethan said nothing. And then, she said, you resigned. In 2020. And 3 months later, you took a maintenance position at a logistics company in Cleveland. And then, here, Cleveland had better schools, he said. She waited. My daughter, he said. Her mother died. I needed to be somewhere that had. He stopped. There were several ways to finish that sentence, and he had never found one that said exactly the right thing without saying too much or too little. I needed to be home by 3:15. Victoria looked at the desk. She was quiet for a moment that felt genuine rather than calculated. In the window behind her, a pigeon landed on the ledge and then reconsidered and left. The leak, she said, finally. The regulatory tip that Tobias had. I've spent the last hour and a half tracking someone who has been feeding information to a competitor for at least 4 months. She looked up. Your translation flagged it before we would have walked into it blind. Do you understand what that means? It means you would have given a misleading answer to a question you didn't know was loaded. It means we would have lost the deal. They looked at each other. "There's also the matter of what you did with the equity clause," she said. "And the subsidiary documentation. You didn't just translate. You analyzed. I noticed things." "Yes, you did." The name on the internal report was Garrett Fields. He was 34, a senior analyst on Victoria's strategic intelligence team, and he had been passing preliminary deal information to a competitor, a rival technology consortium, for at least 4 months, possibly longer. The regulatory review tip had been his most recent communication. It was Marcus Cheng who pieced it together, working backward from the specific language Tobias had used. Only 4 people had access to the internal regulatory memo. One of them was Garrett. Victoria called him into her office that evening and sat across from him while he explained himself. He had a good explanation, not morally good, but structurally coherent. The competitor had offered him a position, he said, and he'd been passed over for a promotion twice in 18 months. And the information he'd been sharing had felt, at the time, minor enough not to matter. He hadn't thought it would affect a deal of this magnitude. He hadn't imagined the regulatory tip would surface during an active negotiation. He said all of this evenly, without particular remorse, in the way of someone who had prepared for this conversation and decided that composure was his best available option. Victoria listened to all of it. She was very good at listening to things she did not want to hear. She had built this quality deliberately, over years, because she had understood early in her career that the information you most needed was usually the information that was most uncomfortable to receive. You had to train yourself to sit still and let it arrive. Then she called building security and had him escorted out. She sat alone in her office for a few minutes after. The city below was doing what the city always did, moving, lit, indifferent. She had terminated people before. It was never a pleasant experience, and she was honest with herself about the fact that it was not supposed to be. She had not built this company by being careless about people. She hired carefully, promoted carefully, trusted slowly. She thought of herself as a good reader of rooms and of the people in them, and yet this morning she had not seen what was happening until a man holding a mop handle had spoken 2 sentences in German and changed the shape of the day. She was not someone who made peace quickly with being wrong, but she was someone who made peace with it. That was different from accepting it. Acceptance was passive. What she was doing was more active, the deliberate recalibration of a model that had turned out to need adjusting. She picked up her phone. "Get me Marcus." When Marcus answered, she said, "Find out everything you can about the custodial contract situation. I want to know what it would take to restructure a position, something that doesn't put a person in a category they're not in." "For Ethan Cole," Marcus said. "For Ethan Cole." 2 days later, a formal offer arrived. Not through the HR portal, through a physical envelope, delivered by hand, left in the supply room where Ethan kept his cart. He opened it during his break. Sitting in the service stairwell with a cup of vending machine coffee that was too hot to drink and tasted, as it always did, faintly of the plastic of the cup. The title on the offer was Director of International Affairs. The salary was 6 times what he currently earned. The benefits package included comprehensive health care, a flexible schedule with personal leave provisions written directly into the contract, and an education stipend that could be applied to dependents. That last part had been someone's idea. Probably not legal's. Ethan reread the stipend clause twice. It was not standard language. It had been put in deliberately by someone who had thought about what he would need rather than simply what the role required. He was not sure how to feel about that. He set the letter on his knee and looked at the stairwell wall, which was painted a shade of industrial beige that had probably been chosen because it was the color least likely to offend anyone. He thought about Lily, who had not been upset about the late pickup the day of the meeting. She'd been pleased, actually, because Sandra had let her help organize the art supply cabinet, which was apparently a rare honor. Lily had described the experience in detailed, satisfied terms for 45 minutes on the drive home, and Ethan had listened to all of it, asking questions when they seemed useful, which was often because Lily's descriptions of things she cared about were worth listening to carefully. He thought about the stairwell in Geneva, where he had stood for 3 minutes after the water treaty was signed, not celebrating, just breathing. He had been 31. He had believed that what he did mattered in ways that would accumulate into something visible. He still believed it mattered. He had stopped believing it needed to be visible, but he also thought about the meeting in Suite A. About the moment when Brower had leaned forward instead of back. About the moment when Al-Mansouri had said, through Ethan's translation, that he was impressed, that Victoria hadn't pretended. He thought about what it had felt like, in that room, to be operating at full capacity for the first time in 3 years, not performing, not concealing, not calibrating himself for invisibility, just working, at the level he knew how to work, in the direction a situation required. It had felt like something he had missed without knowing he was missing it. He thought about the regulatory trap that might have closed on Nexigen if no one had caught the grammatical construction in Tobias's question. He thought about Garrett Fields, who had been feeding information to a competitor for months, and who might have continued indefinitely if the specific wrong combination of language and negotiation had not made his leak visible. There were consequences to absence, Ethan understood. Not being in a room was its own kind of action. He put the envelope in his breast pocket. He finished the coffee. He went back to work. That evening, he called his sister in Portland, the one who had argued, when he'd taken the maintenance job, that he was making a decision from grief and not from clarity. He told her she was wrong. He wasn't sure anymore. What would it look like, she asked, when he'd explained the offer. If you said yes, different, he said. Good different or bad different. He thought of Lily sitting at the kitchen table, doing her Moon essay, asking him to proofread it. She had asked with the easy confidence of a child who expected the answer to be yes, because the answer was always yes. I don't know yet, he said. That might be good different, his sister said. He agreed to think about it. He already knew what he was going to do. He went to Victoria's office on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the letter. He knocked. He was still in his work, uniform gray shirt, dark trousers, the same steel-toed boots he wore every day. He had considered, briefly, wearing something else. Then he had decided that arriving as something other than what he was would be a kind of dishonesty he wasn't interested in. She was at her desk, on a call, and she held up one finger. He waited outside the glass wall. 3 minutes. Then she waved him in. I have a response, he said. Sit down. I'm fine standing. She put her pen down. She waited. I won't take the director position, he said. The title and the travel structure, I've looked at what the role actually requires, and I spent 2 evenings with the organizational chart and the previous holder's calendar. It wouldn't work for my situation. I'd be in a different city 3 weeks out of every 6. We could restructure the travel. I know. But the role itself, the scope of it, it's built for someone who doesn't have a child in the 3rd grade, who needs to be picked up at 3:15. Victoria looked at him steadily. What I will take, Ethan said, is a consultant position, project-based. I'm available for negotiations, document review, high-stakes translation, and anything involving multilateral frameworks. With 2 conditions. Name them. Healthcare. Full family coverage. Not linked to hours or project volume. Done. And the second? I am not available between 3 and 5 on weekdays, or on school closure days, or for anything that requires me to travel overnight without at least 10 days' notice. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the lake was a flat gray expanse under low clouds. You're telling me, she said slowly, that the person who saved a $50 million negotiation wants compensation and health care and a school pickup window. Yes. She looked at her desk. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition. The way a person's face changed when they heard a sentence that clarified something they'd been trying to understand for a while. I'll have the contract drawn up, she said. Thank you. He turned to go. Ethan. He stopped. The subsidiary clause, she said. The one you flagged. It would have cost us the deal if it had gone the other way. Not just 50 million. The credibility to raise the next round. He waited. I've been in this building for 9 years, she said. I've walked past that service corridor a lot of times. I've walked past a lot of corridors. In a lot of buildings. I've been very good at noticing what's relevant and moving past the rest. He waited. I don't, she stopped. Started again. I'm not going to pretend I understand why someone makes the choices you've made, but I notice them now. It was not an apology. He had not wanted one. It was something more precise than that. An acknowledgement that the world had a shape she had not previously accounted for, and that she was now accounting for it. He recognized the gesture. He had seen it in rooms full of powerful people across 12 years of this kind of work. The rare, deliberate moment when someone with authority chose to be honest about the limits of their own perception. It was rarer than it should have been. I'll read the contract when it's ready, he said. The snow came back in the second week of December, the real kind, thick and deliberate. Not the thin suggestion of a November morning. Lily thought it was the best thing that had happened all year, which was saying something because the year had also included a class hamster named Biscuit, a trip to the Science Museum, and her father's inexplicable new habit of having video calls with people who spoke in languages she couldn't identify but found deeply interesting. "Is that French?" she'd asked, standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas one evening. Her head tilted in a way that reminded Ethan, with the small, precise ache it always carried, of her mother. "Arabic," he said. "What are they saying? That they'll have the draft ready by Friday." She considered this. "Is your job different now?" "A little. Do you like it better?" He thought about it seriously, the way he always thought about her questions. She had a way of asking things that did not allow for easy answers, and he had long since stopped trying to give her ones she hadn't earned. "I think I'm more useful," he said. "I'm not sure if that's the same thing as liking it better." She seemed to accept this as an adult answer that she'd need to think about later. She went back to the living room and her book. He watched her go and thought about the word useful the way it had felt, in that conference room. To be operating at full capacity. He was still deciding how much weight to give that feeling. He suspected it was more than he'd been allowing. The consulting work had started slowly. 2 projects in October, a document review for a cross-border licensing agreement, and a 3-hour session supporting a teleconference between Nexigen and a Munich-based partner. Both were remote. Both were done from the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. Victoria had not pressed for more than he offered, which had surprised him. He had expected the incremental expansion of scope that came with anyone discovering a resource they'd previously undervalued. Instead, she had sent the assignments one at a time, with notes that were professional and specific, and asked for nothing beyond what was described. He was still deciding what to make of that, too. On a Friday in the second week of December, Ethan picked Lily up from school at 3:15 exactly. The snow was coming down in slow, even waves, the kind that made the city look briefly patient with itself. Lily had a paper snowflake she'd cut during art, and was holding it flat so it wouldn't bend, navigating the icy front steps with the careful lateral steps of someone transporting something fragile. "You're walking like a penguin," Ethan said. "I'm walking like a person protecting a snowflake," she corrected. They were halfway to the car, when a dark sedan pulled up to the curb, a company car, not unusual in this part of the neighborhood near the offices. The door opened. Victoria Hale stepped out. She was in a coat he hadn't seen before, charcoal gray, and she had her hands in her pockets. She looked, without the executive floor and the glass-walled offices and the $50 million negotiation around her, like someone who had simply come to find a person, not a resource, not a problem, a person. Lily looked at her with open curiosity. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Victoria said. "Nice snowflake. I did the cuts myself. Most people tear theirs. I believe it." Victoria looked up at Ethan. "The contract's signed on our end. I thought I'd deliver it in person." She held out an envelope. He took it. "You didn't have to do that." "No, I was in the area." She hadn't been in the area. He could tell. It was about a mile out of her way, and she'd come on a Friday afternoon in a snowstorm, which was the kind of thing people did when they wanted to do a thing and needed a reason to give it. He did not point this out. He was familiar with the impulse. Lily was looking between them with the calibrating attention of a child who was assembling something and not yet certain what the pieces made. "Are you Ba's boss?" she asked Victoria. "We're working together," Victoria said. "On some projects. He's good at languages," Lily said. "He taught me how to say, 'Where is the library?' in 4 languages, but I can only remember 2 of them now." "Which 2? "French and Arabic. The French one sounds better," The Arabic one is more useful, Ethan said. You always say that, Lily said. Victoria looked at him. There was something in her face he'd started to recognize over the past weeks. Not the CEO reading a room, but something less armored. The face of someone in the process of adjusting their understanding of something, and finding the process neither comfortable nor unwelcome. I was going to suggest coffee, she said. If you have time. There's a place on Mercer with a good hot chocolate, apparently. She glanced at Lily. On good authority. Lily's eyes went wide. The one with the marshmallows that are shaped like stars? I don't know about the marshmallows. They're shaped like stars, Lily confirmed. I've been there once. A long time ago. 8 months ago, Ethan said. That's a long time, Lily said firmly. Victoria was trying not to smile. She wasn't entirely succeeding. The snow came down around them, slow and indifferent and clean, and the city ran its usual noise underneath it. Traffic, a bus, the particular muffled quality of urban sound in snowfall that made everything feel slightly more private than it was. Ethan looked at the envelope in his hand. He looked at his daughter, who was already angling her body toward the direction of Mercer Street, snowflake carefully elevated. He looked at Victoria, who had driven a mile out of her way on a Friday in December and was offering nothing more than coffee, and seemed to understand, with the precision she brought to most things, that this was the correct amount to offer. We have time, he said. Lily took his hand. She was already talking something about the star marshmallows, and whether they'd be there in the evening if they went now, and whether stars melted in hot chocolate or stayed firm. Victoria listened to this with an expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else but occupied the space between them, and Ethan listened to it and thought, this is what ordinary feels like when it is exactly what it is supposed to be. Victoria fell into step on his other side. They walked up the block in the snow, 3 people moving at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be, and was not in any particular hurry to arrive because the arriving was not, it turned out, the most important part of it.